Hello, readers and reckoners. My name is TB Skyan, and as you can probably hear, I have been a little sick over the holidays. Still, 2018 is over, which means it's time to, reflect on the year that was. Reflect on the things that have happened to us and take stock of where we are as a culture and see how far. What I mean is it's time to make list articles because we're all getting over our hangovers. For today, I'm going to be listing some of my favorite lore to come out of League of Legends in 2018. Now, for those who may be wondering, yes, I am in fact still pissed about Riot's raging hypocrisy in protecting their COO from the consequences of his awful behavior, and I will be bringing that up in my League of Legends videos completely unprompted, and I'm afraid you're just all going to have to deal with that. Anyway, in no particular order, here's my personal top 5. Number 1, the lore. So this year, Riot introduced a new sub-universe to their skin lines with the Odyssey universe, a rather interesting sci-fi, space opera, fantasy hybrid thing that also seemed to be intersecting with the Darkstar universe. They sold the setup of that universe really well with an animated short to go along with the release of the skin line, as well as a rather fun and excellent little alternate game mode that I hope will be coming back in the future. But in order to really establish the universe and sort of set up the broader parts of that new mythology, they published a long-form short story chronicling the creation and the rise of the primary villain of the Odyssey universe, Kain, and how he came to become to possess that terrible scythe Rast. And the lore did a really good job of establishing the groundwork and doing a lot of the difficult world building for explaining the rules of that particular universe, the social organization, and the people who are at play, and telling us something about the kind of man that Kain used to be, how he was tempted into taking up the scythe and corrupting himself, and showing us some of the tragic loss that ultimately came along with that terrible decision. It manages to make you feel that loss of personhood in a pretty effective way, and it does this while working within the constraints of ultimately being a very short piece of fiction that's doing a lot of heavy lifting for what seems to be a rather extensive universe. Dan Abnett, the writer of that particular story, does a really good job of compressing the time frame of the action that happens in the story without making things seem overly rushed or seeming to be in too much of a rush to do world building or establish terminology, and that's a really difficult balance to walk. So I enjoyed the lore a lot, and I hope that they're going to be following up on that further, perhaps with more skins being introduced to the skin line sometime later in the year. Number 2, The Eye in the Abyss. The Eye in the Abyss by Anthony Reynolds might, on reflection, be the best piece of lore that League of Legends put out this year. And I say that specifically because it's the only story I read this year that I felt like could work as a short story on its own, completely and utterly disconnected from the League of Legends universe. Yes, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there about the Howling Abyss and Lysandra and stuff like that, but the main action of the story and the main thrust of the themes that it's putting forward would feel perfectly at home in some kind of fantasy anthology that you'd find sold at conventions, maybe edited by George R.R. Martin or something like that, without really feeling too out of place or like you're missing out on much of a wider mythology. It's very self-contained and does a great job of establishing its own characters, its own stakes, and its own continuity. And it manages to do all this in spite of having a lot of heavy lifting to do when it comes to building out the League of Legends universe. It has to explore and expand the Frostguard tribe, who they are, what kind of culture that they inhabit. It has to establish what kind of place the Freljord is and the Frostguard's place in it. It has to establish, relatable, likable characters whose adventure and whose trials and tribulations you can root for. You have to want them to come back from the journey into the abyss. And it has to sell the unfathomable cosmic horror of the Watchers to establish the ticking time bomb of their reemergence. Like, that's one of the primary purposes of the story, is to establish that, oh crap, the Watchers are breaking through the Howling Abyss. This is a terrible thing for Runeterra. How are people going to be reacting to it as they finally find out, or when it happens? And this is necessary because Lysandra also received a lore update that revised her motivations rather substantially. She's now someone who is alternately working against the Void, trying to delay its emergence for as long as possible, but who's also been working with the Void in order to extend her own, lifespan on the planet before it's finally completely destroyed by the Void. And that's a very complex set of character motivations, and in order for those to make sense, you have to really get a real feeling for just how terrible the creatures that lurk in the Howling Abyss really are, and how much of an existential threat they are to everything. And the Eye in the Abyss manages to do a really good job of this without sort of disappearing into the butthole of its own mythology. It's expert management in terms of, balancing exposition and world building with character moments, and it's pretty compelling to read just as a short story without any League of Legends connections. Number 3. The True and Ghastly Tale of the Beast of Balam Tower. Someone at Riot has been reading Terry Pratchett, I think. I'm certainly feeling his influence in the lore update that Veigar got this year, and I approve of it because at the moment I feel like League of Legends takes its cues more from stuff like Warhammer and Lord of the Rings, which there's nothing wrong with, but it's also a very big, very silly, very cartoony, and sometimes very funny fantasy universe, and the influence of Pratchett and Discworld should really be more in evidence in a universe like that, at least in my opinion. As for the story itself, Veigar has always been a rather one-note joke character. He's a literal walking Napoleon complex without a lot to him. It's just he's small, but he's powerful, and that contradiction is funny. Ha ha. His narrative rework has left him still a joke character, but a joke with a lot more pathos. Veigar's psychosis, his obsession with being evil, is his way to cope with trauma, while his fundamental goodness as a Yordle keeps asserting himself by making him choose to do evil overlord things that, air quotes, accidentally make the world better and rescues other people from the suffering that he once had to go through. And that's a really clever way to go about it. It allows for Veigar to remain a funny, oh, he's powerful and dangerous, but he's undercut because he's tiny and adorable, and it lets him stay that kind of a joke, but it also allows enough room to tell more insightful stories about trauma and how we deal with it, if Riot ever wants to go in that direction with his character. The story is perhaps a little bit underwritten and maybe a little bit too enamored with its own joke to be a really great piece of short fiction, but it still manages to do the job really well and establishes Veigar as a very likable and fun character who it seems like would just be kind of interesting to hang out with and see what he gets up to, which is kind of important because, again, Veigar used to be such a one-note nothing. Number 4. The Cage. Aatrox's rework had a lot of work to do. It had to reframe him as a character away from being this sort of vague, demonic master of war entity that maybe had something to do with Tryndamere once upon a time, and who knows what that was all about, into someone who's much more deeply tied in with the history of Shurima and Ascension, and perhaps even with the history of Targon, and it had to do a lot of lifting to redefine and codify the entire Darkin race. Now, some of that work had been done by Varys already, but it was very incomplete, and Aatrox's rework essentially had to do most of the job of reintegrating them into the wider lore of the universe. Aatrox had so many lore jobs to do that his personal storytelling could have pretty easily gotten lost in the scramble, and in some ways, it kind of did. Aatrox wants to destroy the universe as a means to escape from the confinement of the sword that he's been trapped in. In order for that kind of extreme psychology to be comprehensible, let alone sympathetic, we need to understand viscerally what kinds of powerful needs and emotions are driving that desire. And what's interesting about Aatrox is that his cosmic destruction quest is not some kind of intellectualized nihilism pontificating about, oh, everything is meaningless if you think about it, therefore the only meaningful choice is destruction. And it's not some narcissistic remake the universe in my image God delusion, or even any kind of ideological conviction. What drives Aatrox is a flailing, screaming, terrified animal desperation to escape an eternity of solitary confinement and involuntary sensory deprivation. He's not really a nihilist or even an existentialist. He's a hedonist who's desperate to feel, even for just one moment, anything that isn't horror or sustained suffering. So the short story The Cage therefore reads less like the sophisticated manifesto of a global conqueror and more like the angsty live journal of a teenager dealing with their first heartbreak. Like a teenager, Aatrox is entirely in his feelings. He's entirely trapped in the present of his misery. And like a teenager, his pain renders him utterly incapable of understanding anything other than his misery and his need to escape from it. Unlike a teenager, however, Aatrox's misery doesn't come from accidentally embarrassing himself in front of his crush. It comes from an actual horrifying and inescapable suffering. I will remind you that solitary confinement and sensory deprivation are actual torture methods used in the real world to horrifyingly scar and destroy people psychologically and emotionally, and he's been going through it for over 1,000 years. The thesis of Aatrox as a character is therefore interesting to me because A lot of villains will have tragic backstories that make them strong and cool and powerful and give them complicated ideological motivations and radical ideas about how to reorganize the world. The story of Aatrox, however, is that pain and suffering doesn't empower you or ennoble you or in any way elevate you. It doesn't make you cool or give you insight or a better personality. It just reduces you. You become a screaming, flailing, pathetic, desperate animal. And that, to me, is a lot more compelling as characterization for a character like Aatrox than any sort of quiet, reserved, intellectual, smart warrior poet characterization ever would be. Number 5. Legends of Bilgewater. The audio drama is a criminally underexplored form of lore delivery in Western gaming. Written lore is nice and all, and comics are nice and all, and animated shorts are nice and all, but in order to experience any of that, you do have to sit down in front of a web page and scroll for half an hour, or read for 20 minutes, or watch for 10 minutes while the thing is playing out in front of you. An audio drama, much like audiobooks, is the kind of thing you can put on while you're doing dishes, or while you're on the way to work, or, even while you're playing the game that you're supposed to be learning about. It's a much more flexible way of experiencing the world, and it's also just very enjoyable. You really should never underestimate just how much the delivery and performance of a good voice actor can elevate material. As written stories, the vignettes of Legends of Bilgewater are perfectly decent, but mostly unremarkable. If these had just been published as written stories, I don't think I really would have given them much of a time of day, but the delivery and the character of the voice actor playing Lars, and I still would love to know who's actually providing that voice, makes them feel like a much more authentic and compelling set of folk tales. And the sound design makes Bilgewater come alive as a place in a way that mere text struggles to really replicate. The best one of the shorts in The Legends of Bilgewater might be Fizz and the Lucky Kraken, because of how it presents Fizz's innocent troublemaking as the source of genuine tragedy in a way that feels pretty authentic to such a superstitious society of sailors. I really do hope Riot puts out more audio dramas in the vein of Legends of Bilgewater, because I think it's a really effective way to build out the universe, and League of Legends is already making absolutely not enough use of the many talented voice actors that they have brought in over the ages to put voices to their characters, and this would be a really nice way to start integrating them back into the fandom and the culture of the game. And that, in no particular order, is my top 5 pieces of League of Legends lore this year. So I'm curious what other people enjoyed, though. So if you have a personal top 5 that you'd like to talk about, feel free to leave it down in the comments, or tell me about a piece that I didn't mention that really managed to resonate with you. Now, my praise of all of these pieces of lore is a little contingent, and it's contingent on whether Riot will actually follow up on any of it. As we've discussed on this channel many times before, the biggest issue with League of Legends lore is and always has been that Riot as a company likes to make and publish new stuff a lot more than they like doing follow-up and maintenance on the stuff they have already published. The lore is an endless fray of dangling plot threads, and what I'll be looking for in 2019 is whether Riot can start gathering those threads and weave something out of them. History tells me I shouldn't be too optimistic about those prospects, but I would like to be proven wrong. Hey, thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, there's a subscribe button down below that you can click on to get more videos that are sort of kind of mostly like it. You can also click the bell icon to be sure that you get to see those videos, because YouTube doesn't, otherwise it just might not show you because of reasons. I don't know why. You can also comment down below, like with your own top 5, or if you have another story you'd like to talk about, then the comments are for that. I do read all of my comments. I do pay pretty close attention to them as much as I can. You can also hit the like button if you want to help out the channel in like the search algorithm, yada whatever stuff. And if you are willing and able to do so, you can support the channel on Patreon, where there's some rewards, and I'm going to be reworking those rewards a little bit later in the year, so look for that. If you're not really compelled by it right now, maybe later in the year there's going to be something that's more compelling to you. If you want to, if you're able to, then I would be very grateful to receive the support, because it's that really, ad revenue really doesn't keep this channel afloat. It's the support of people who enjoy the work that I do here. So if you're willing and able to, I'd be very grateful. If you don't want to do the recurring thing every month, you just want to maybe make a one-time donation as a kind of tip or something, well, I do have a coffee link as well, where you can make a donation in like $3 increments, because that's the way the site works, to essentially buy me a coffee, as it were. Although right now I'm more inclined to spend the money on tea, to be honest. If you haven't enjoyed the video, of course, there's also an option for that. You will see down below this video there is a dislike button, and while my list is certainly not final for the year, it's only barely begun, this dislike button generally does stand a pretty good chance of making it into my top 10 dislike buttons of the year list. Like, when you look at it, it has a decent set of proportions to it that really does evoke the character design feeling of what a dislike button is supposed to do, and the personal narrative of the dislike button has really been evolving in a rather interesting way, and I'm going to be curious to see where the dislike button is going to be going from here, like whether it's going to be exploring the more emotional nuances of the story that's being told here, or whether they're going to go more in an action-oriented direction of the kind that, like, with a little bit of luck, might be adapted into a major motion picture at some point in the year, and really would lend itself well to the emotional beats of the grand action narrative picture. Like, you know, the clicking and the mouse moves and stuff like that, I feel like that really lends itself well to a cinematic perspective. So, you know, if you want to vote for this dislike button for one of the dislike buttons of the year, then please don't click the dislike button and click the like button instead. That's going to be the thing that counts as the vote, because the thing I want you to do is not click the dislike button, because the like button is better than the than the dislike button. Oh god, I need to rest my voice.